So nice to see you all. I'm really happy that I have close to 70 people here willing to learn some things about TERFs and collectively join me in fist shaking against their turfiness in our libraries. I am Djaz Zulida. My pronouns are they, them. And I work for the Brooklyn Public Library. I'm also a board member for Urban Librarians Unite. And that's a little bit about me. So let's get this exciting presentation started. And again, this is definitely meant to be interactive. So please feel free to ask questions. Ask questions in good faith that we can answer, or if you think you have a question and you're not entirely sure how to ask it, or if it's right to ask in this forum, Google is very helpful, and sounds like you need to be educated on transgender people, but okay is a fabulous online group that can help with that as well. Okay. So before I launch into the main bits of the content of this, I just want to say that this is a brave space, a safe space, where you can ask questions and, but at the same time, you really need to make sure that you're respecting anybody who is not cisgender, and there's zero tolerance for transphobia, homophobia, racism, etc. If anybody's making you feel uncomfortable, or saying things that are harmful, absolutely let us know, because that's not cool for this. I wanted to start off with a brief meditation, just because this is a really stressful subject, and 2020 has been like 927 years long, and even now the chaos isn't over. Join me while we do some breathing in and out as we meditate on this very fine dumpster fire of a year. Okay, so you're gonna breathe in, and then breathe out slowly as the dumpster fire comes back into focus. Breathe in, and breathe out. I always find it very helpful, breathe in, when talking about really stressful subjects, to just sort of reset my limbic system by remembering that I have lungs. I encourage you all to breathe out, and always take some time to breathe, because it's important and we don't want to fall over. Okay, so if you're at a talk on TERFs, you probably know what a TERF is, but just in case, TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminism, which sort of differentiates it from regular old radical feminism that is actually trans inclusive, but it's sort of a general catch-all term. TERFs believe that gender and sex are fixed, it's biological, nothing can be changed ever. There are some very negative stereotypes, and trans folks are often painted as confused or predators, especially trans women. One of my favorite terms for TERFs is actually FART, which stands for Feminism Appropriating Reactionary Transphobe. And it's just sort of a nice little way to sort of thumb my nose at TERF behavior. There's also a term that I like to warn people about, which is gender critical. Gender critical is just TERFy rhetoric. It's not any different. It's just a way to sort of control the terminology and soften what it means to be against trans people. And it's often really associated with concern trolling, right? It's not that we're against trans, it's just think of the children, you know, which I think we all know can be pretty toxic. So why are TERFs using library spaces? There are a lot of different reasons, but you know, basically it boils down to our meeting spaces are free or cheap, and that's like an automatic magnet. So yes, we draw in some interesting folks with that, but we can also draw in TERFs who are looking for a space. We are community hubs, right? So they get an automatic audience, they get free advertising, and sometimes it's really easy to let them slip in, or it's hard to keep them out because library policies are pretty vague. They haven't been revised in a million years. There's no real review process, or the dreaded neutrality and free speech arguments, where yes, neutrality can be important in some ways, and free speech is an important value. But at the same time, these can often be weaponized in ways that favor, you know, featuring the voices of people who are oppressive. So we need to have both sides, but, you know, TERFs want to come into the library and talk about how trans people aren't really people, but they also want to cancel any events that they personally find offensive, like drag queen story time, because think of the children. Some of the places that TERF events have been in libraries are Seattle, Toronto, Vancouver. Those three places successfully, quote unquote, successfully held TERF events. New York Public Library was contacted for space booking, but from my understanding, it didn't get that far. The Fletcher Free Library in Burlington, Vermont was all set to go ahead with the event, and the group Gender Critical Vermont canceled, and then didn't seem to reschedule elsewhere in the community. And then the Glasgow Women's Library is actually pretty interesting. They are very inclusive in their space, and they were working and offering event space for the Audacious Women Festival when they found out that basically that festival said, yeah, trans women can attend, but they need a special certification showing that they're trans and they've had, you know, gender, you know, based treatments, or they pass so well that you can't tell. So they said, heck no, and they refused to let people come in for the event at their library, which was great. Some of these groups have been separate, but Megan Murphy did the Vancouver event, the Toronto event that really blew up and drew a lot of attention to this, and then also went to the Seattle Library. She did try and come to the East Coast to NYPL, but thankfully that got shut down. I really thought that this year was going to be like the TERF shakedown of public libraries, because it seemed like things were ramping up, right? We had, you know, Vancouver in 2019, we had Toronto in 2019, then 2020 was Seattle, and then Vermont was scheduled to happen. And I really think that if it hadn't been for the pandemic, we might have faced a lot more of these challenges. The one small silver lining to the pandemic, and even though it's been a really difficult pandemic and we're still in the middle of it, one small silver lining is that if our libraries are closed, TERFs can't try and come in to use our space. This doesn't mean we get to relax, because as we begin reopening, we enter into different phases. We start thinking about programming again. You know, it's entirely possible that this could ramp up again. So how do we plug up some of the holes in our libraries to make it harder for hate groups and hate-filled groups to utilize our space and assets? How do we minimize that vulnerability? Yes, we want to support freedom of speech and First Amendment rights and, you know, being welcoming to all. But on the other side of that coin is the very real responsibility of making sure our patrons are protected and making sure that we're not allowing a minority voice of, you know, a hate-filled group. It may not be classified as a hate group per se, but hate-filled groups to really take over our spaces. Things we can look at, codes of conduct, meeting room policies, you know, and one of the things that you also want to think about too is, you know, if you're cis, how are you protecting your trans employees from anti-trans library activities that they may not have control over? You know, how do you reduce that impact? You know, paying attention to these things. A lot of libraries will say, oh, we're following ALA guidelines or we're following state guidelines, but it's possible to go beyond those and make sure that we're explicitly protecting not just trans and gender nonconforming patrons, but also staff. So I'm actually wondering if anybody has explicit language in their codes of conduct, their contracts, their guidelines that specifically protect trans people. So if anybody wants to pop anything into the chat or raise your hand, feel free to do so, because I'm actually genuinely curious about, you know, how libraries are working towards this and what direction folks are moving in, if it's something that people are thinking about, or if it's something that hasn't really shown up on anybody's radar. Lauren?
I just wanted to let you know that the chat has been disabled.
Oh, chat is disabled.
Yes.
Oh, well, that will make participation complicated.
Well, hi, it's Christina. So chat is disabled in the Zoom platform. However, if you do want to interact, you can put your questions in the feed loop chat and I'll read it out loud for Djaz.
Okay, so I kept checking chats to see if anybody had anything that they wanted to ask so far. So maybe we'll just pause here for like 2 minutes. And if you have any questions about the previous slides that we didn't get to, or you want to talk about policies and procedures, please pop that into feed loop.
So we have Alexandra from Patron Public Library. I am in charge of the meeting room bookings at my library. Have not yet had this issue, but they're glad they're here to learn.
Excellent. Yeah, so it's great that you haven't had the issue, but there's always that yet hovering. We really don't know if TERFs are going to continue targeting libraries and looking for our spaces and other community spaces to, you know, host events. But it seems pretty likely because that's how they've made use of libraries before. And, you know, again, because we are a community space and we are usually free or really cheap, you know, that's just a sort of a shining beacon to pretty much anyone. And TERFs are, you know, somebody that we probably want to try and see if we can mitigate or avoid having them at all. So use the time now when you haven't had this as an issue and take a look at those meeting room policies and think about like, okay, how can I look at this policy and see if I have any loopholes for groups that would be more harmful than helpful to our community members. You know, I don't have like one specific solution for reducing vulnerability, but if we don't really start to examine what our conduct codes say, if we haven't touched them in 5-10 years, you know, it's really time to start thinking about that. It's much better to be proactive and figure out ways to answer these kinds of challenges or requests from TERF related groups before it's an issue, because we can plan better when it's not in the heat of the moment.
Also, Rakisha has a comment from Brooklyn Public Library. These topics come up during it hasn't been addressed in my system yet, but I know there was some concern that we would face it. These topics come up during election season, but not this one because our libraries were closed.
Thank you for that comment, Rakisha. We work at the same library. So I definitely, once I heard that Megan Murphy had tried to book space at the New York Public Library, I had asked upper management actually about, you know, what our meeting room policy said and if there are ways that we could adjust it and protect it. I did not get a particularly clear answer, and I really don't think anything had changed. You know, I think the thinking is if it hasn't been a problem yet, then, you know, do we really need to make a rule about it? But again, my stance on that is pretty firm. You know, if it's an issue and it's been an issue in other libraries, it could be an issue in your own library.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
We do have a question from two different people, but it's the same question. So
Okay.
Elizabeth from Richmond Memorial Library and Courtney from Millbrook Library both asked, what are some examples of language that they can use to refresh their own policies?
That is an excellent question. I am not a policy guy, but I think looking to what your local laws and rules say about trans rights and trans access to public spaces can be helpful. Taking a look at trans and LGBTQ organizations and seeing what their policy stances are, what issues they're dealing with, reaching out to them can be helpful. Going directly to the experts, basically. You know, some simple things like if your union contract doesn't explicitly have protections for gender expression and gender identity and all of that, there's no better time than now to start pushing for that. I think one of the things that you can contemplate is looking at what your code of conduct says. And if it says something like, you know, no, you know, fomenting violence or, you know, something of that nature where, you know, you're discouraging people from, you know, verbal abuse and physical abuse. Anti-trans rhetoric is dangerous. Transgender Day of Remembrance is coming up on November 20th, and, you know, hundreds of people who are trans are murdered without any recourse. You know, in the US, the numbers are lower, but in other countries throughout the world, you know, language has power, and anti-trans language is powerful. So taking that language, looking at what is the group espousing, what, you know, look at, you know, take a look at some of your local groups if you know of any that exist, or do a quick Google search and see what kind of rhetoric they're using, and if any of it feels like an incitement to violence, or the case could be made for that. Maybe you can adjust your language saying like this is prohibited because of, or otherwise make it difficult for certain groups to come into the library. I would like to understand library policy and procedure creation myself. So I'm a pretty new librarian. There might be some folks who are more expert than I am in this. So anybody is welcome to chime in if they have language that they like to use or a framework that they base their decisions off of. So after all of that grim stuff, talking about, you know, TERFs and our space and our vulnerabilities, I really want to talk about what trans inclusion looks like. And this is definitely not a complete list. There are so many other ways to make sure that trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary and, you know, everyone feels welcome in your library. But these are some of the things that can help. So making sure you have inclusive restrooms where menstrual products aren't just relegated to the women's room, having changing tables in every restroom, having a single stall, family, gender neutral, all gender bathroom, and having signage. There are some bathroom signs that sort of have a half man, half woman stick figure, which I am pretty strongly against because trans people aren't stick figures and we're certainly not half of this and half of that. But you may have some constraints based around what your town or your municipality may be using already. But if possible, if you have control over your restroom signage, try and make sure that it's something really neutral, like a toilet that says bathroom, and, you know, skip the stick figures altogether. Pronouns. Normalizing sharing pronouns is super important, especially if you are cisgender. Normalizing sharing pronouns and not assuming the pronouns of others can be a really great way to give people the space to use different pronouns and to feel okay with talking about them. If you can notice, I have gone in and changed my name on Zoom to Djaz and they and them. Christina has she and her. Renaming yourself and adding your pronouns into Zoom is great. If you are having a library event where you're chatting with different folks, normalize saying your pronouns. It doesn't necessarily mean pronouns need to be mandatory. Some people are not going to feel comfortable sharing them. But it is good to sort of take it away from the default of assuming that everybody is either she, her, or he, him. Inclusive language is another thing that's super important. So if you have mommy and me programs or new moms or dads and donuts or anything that's like gendering a program, it's really important to ask yourself why. And if the only reason is it's because this is how we've done it, now that we're, you know, re-looking at libraries and we're dealing with pandemic closures and figuring out what reopening looks like, maybe now is a really opportune time to start taking a look at what you're calling things and why. Calling something dads and whatever, or moms and whatever, can be really exclusive to different groups. Parents and guardians, grown-ups, you know, your adult in charge, all of those terms can be more inclusive and really give more people in different parenting roles a say. Friends, folks, kiddos, y'all, those are great ways to address crowds of people rather than saying ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. One kind of humorous one that I like is theydies and gentlethems, which is a little silly, but it's also fun and can be a really good way to include more folks in the room. And another thing, if you're complimenting a kid or a baby, think about compliments that are neutral, right? So if you see a little person who happens to be a boy or presents as a boy, and you're like, oh, that boy looks really strong, or he must be so tough. Ask yourself, what other aspects of that child could I praise that don't bring gender into it, right? Little girls don't need to be pretty or sweet. Little boys don't need to be tough or strong. You know, children are just children. And so, you know, when engaging with the public, when talking to our patrons, when saying hi to the people that we love and miss in our communities, shifting language, even if it's just by small degrees, can have an impact. And I do want to pause here also right now to say, are folks moving away from gendered programs? Do you still have programs with a gender title? Do you have any great gender neutral titles that you've switched to? I want to say I've heard somebody say they did parents and pancakes. But definitely, or if anybody has any terms of address that they like to use that are more neutral, I would definitely love to hear it.
We actually have a few questions if you want to take those.
Sure.
So Liliana from Cutchog New Suffolk Free Library asks, what do you suggest we could do to encourage a more inclusive environment, but receiving pushback from staff and patrons?
It depends on how ready you are to saddle up your dragon and wade into a fight. It depends on your community, your position, your seniority, your library environment, if communication is open or if communication tends to be on the more toxic side. There's no one size fits all for this. But I do recommend seeing if you have other allies amongst your staff or in the public who can help advocate for this. If it's not just one person asking for more inclusive language, and it's a group instead, that can help push it forward because it shows more people want it. Also, you know, if you have control over planning events or programs, or, you know, you are, you know, run the children's room, you know, if you have some of that autonomy, you can shift the language yourself. And then if you end up facing some pushback from, you know, a member of the public or, you know, someone on your staff or your employer, you know, that can be a good time to figure out, is this a battle that I can fight myself? Is this something I want to re-strategize? Is this something that they are open to having a conversation about? There are some really, really great resources that talk about pronouns and gender and all of that exciting stuff that I would definitely talk about in a little bit. Sometimes that little bit of education can be really helpful. And also, one of the good things that you can do is you can point to, you know, our common library language of inclusive to all, welcoming to all. If we want to welcome everyone, then we want to welcome everyone and not just people who fit into these neat categories. There are going to be plenty of people in your community who are taking care of kids, but they're not a mom or a dad. They might be non-binary. They might be an uncle or a grandparent or a cousin who's taking care of these young people. Using language that makes them feel welcome is not, you know, you can pivot away from the gender inclusive sort of angle of the argument and bring it towards, yes, well, we want to include everyone. So what about people who are not biological parents? Maybe we want to say something different. You know, or yes, we've always done it this way, but hey, it's 2020 and maybe we should try something different. You know, there's going to be all sorts of different avenues. Nothing is perfect, and nothing is necessarily going to be straightforward. But it can't hurt to try. And again, that consensus building and group building to try and get more folks to advocate for the same thing can be very helpful.
And we have, oh yeah, we have one more question.
Okay, sure.
So, Cachette from Irvington Public Library says, I use email signatures and put my pronouns on my Zoom profile, but I still often see patrons, presenters, and colleagues using the wrong ones for me. Is there a constructive way to emphasize these language shifts?
I don't know, teleporting them into a volcano? Yes, it's really frustrating when people see these markers and ignore them. Or, you know, they've only known you technically as a they, them, but for some reason, they look at you and see, oh, you're a delicate lady type. You're obviously a she or her. It's frustrating, and it can be really hurtful to have people look past your indications of, please acknowledge this part of my existence and my humanity. Again, it's really going to come down to what kind of environment you're in. Some libraries are really supportive, but they're just supportive and they don't take action to actually help you get your pronouns and your name and all of that respected. There are some libraries who are completely unsupportive, and you know, it may not be a battle that you can win. You occasionally do luck out with you know, library environments where not only are you being supported, but it's active rather than passive. I think one of the things that I would recommend is seeing if you have a good coworker that you are close with that can maybe help speak up when you are having excuse me, when you are having people use the wrong pronoun, misgender you, dead name you. If you can find an ally, sometimes that can take some of the weight off of having to constantly advocate for yourself and for being recognized for who you are. Other things that I've definitely thought about when people get my pronouns wrong. I really have honestly and genuinely thought about just getting a bunch of t-shirts with pronouns in like 6-inch letters, just like across the front and the back that just say they. Sometimes like subtlety and classy little pins and delicate email signatures, you know, and changing your Zoom pronouns isn't a big enough sign. But I guess I would say ultimately, you know, if you are being misgendered, if you are being dead named, if people are not giving a strong effort to get your pronouns correct, it might be time to talk to a supervisor if they're not part of the problem, human resources, with the caveat that many human resources staff are neither human nor resources. But formalizing it, if it really becomes problematic and painful and you're not able to nudge things or otherwise influence it in other directions. Any other questions, Christina?
Oh, here's a good question. From Marin from Groveland Correctional Facility. Does anyone have pronouns attached to Patreon accounts?
Oh, that is an excellent question. I definitely have not heard of that. I wonder if that's something that could go in a notes field. I mean, there's still plenty of catalogs that still have like male or female as genders, and that's the only two options. But yeah, if there's anybody out there who popped pronouns into records for patrons, please speak up.
That's all the questions for now.
Okay. So maybe that's a question that doesn't get answered this second, but I would definitely encourage anyone who is thinking about pronouns in patron records to maybe connect. That definitely sounds like a cool idea. I don't know where we'd put it, but maybe like a blocking note that pops up every time somebody borrows something. There's probably a couple of different ways you could implement that. But you definitely want to make sure that patrons were explicitly opting into it. Trans inclusion also looks like thinking beyond what we're doing now. So Drag Queen Story Hour, controversial, complicated, wonderful, exciting. It's all of those things for different libraries. And I know many libraries have faced protests and, you know, community disapprobation. And it's certainly a great program to bring to a community because it does show gender expansiveness and is just a fun way to have an entertainer come and do story time. But how are you showing that gender expansiveness and expression and representation past that? Because drag is a certain aesthetic, right? You know, it tends to be pretty exaggerated. It tends to be a little campy or flamboyant. And those are all wonderful things, but that's not the end all and be all of gender expression. You know, it's good to model, excuse me, it's good to model gender expansiveness through other programs. I know in Boston, there's a group called the Pineapple Project that really talks about gender roles and, you know, in a way that's appropriate and fun for little kids. Taking away gendered book selection. So if a mom comes in and she's like, I really want some boy books for my son. Okay, so the first thought is like, okay, boy books, robots, cars, superheroes. Learning to be aware of some of these just biases that we have because of the way we're socialized and just because of the way our culture is really important. It can help steer you away from saying, okay, well, you know, I'm putting together, you know, a pile of books for a boy. I definitely better not include anything with, you know, a girl protagonist or, you know, a princess or, you know, maybe something that isn't about like explosions or Minecraft. Making sure you are not gendering toys by boy toys or girl toys, or, you know, just printing out, I don't know, what, Shopkins? Little kids love Shopkins still, right? Coloring sheets and then giving boys, you know, cars. Subtly shifting those things to make sure that any child who comes into the library can play with whatever they want, can read whatever they want, helps to model that expansiveness in gender rather than restricting it really strongly to a binary. Which sort of brings me to thinking about LGBTQ events and displays and whatnot in the library. So there's Pride Month. And Pride Month tends to be a holiday that a lot of libraries will acknowledge in some way. They might have events, they might have displays, it might be a lot of things, it might just be a couple things, but there are so many more times of the year where you can include trans people, where you can include non-binary people, where you could include gender non-conforming and genderqueer people. That time is all the times, right? So if you're having a something for Women's History Month, make sure you're including trans women. If you are doing a display for Black History Month, pardon me, what Black trans women can you include? What Black trans men, what Black non-binary folks are there that you can include and share with people? Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, literally any time where you are saying like, yes, let me create a display, let me have an event. Think about who you're selecting, who you're considering, and then that sort of brings me over to the idea of collection development, right? So you can't make book displays featuring queer and trans people if you don't have them in your collection. Own voices is so important. Making sure that you're having trans content by trans authors. You know, it's great to have a book about a mom raising a transgender son, but that really centers the cisgender perspective. It centers the parent, and, you know, it doesn't center the experience and gender of the child. I've definitely read a few of these memoirs talking about raising a trans kid, you know, that feel really uncomfortable. They might, you know, mix up names and pronouns and, you know, otherwise sort of messily work out their own feelings around gender and their child in a book format, which can be pretty distressing, you know, because it's not necessarily respecting the identity of the child who's being written about. So that's something to consider. Intersectionality is always important for everything, but it's particularly important for trans writing. So make sure it's not just, you know, Chaz Bono and Caitlyn Jenner and, you know, every other, you know, white or white passing trans person who may fit neatly into a binary. You want to make sure that you are getting the breadth and depth of the trans and gender nonconforming experience. And you can't get that if every person on the cover looks the same. And it's incredibly important as well, not to just have books about trans pain and queer suffering and, you know, tragedy and death, because one, that's just fucking depressing. It's brutal. And there are books that talk about gender euphoria and trans joy and accomplishment and expression that are so valuable and are so needed. One of the things that I always keep in mind when I'm in the public library and it's not COVID, you know, I am sort of a living example of a trans non-binary person who has successfully grown up and become a professional. And I can model that by being in my library and being out and, you know, being a safe person for people to talk to. That's important also in your collections. And I just want to mention that Trans Day of Remembrance is coming up on November 20th. Trans Day of Visibility and Trans Day of Remembrance are a little complicated because they are pretty weighty, and they have no shortage of controversy, you know, from within the queer community and trans community and from without. But they are things to also consider, but make sure that these things are done really intentionally and respectfully, and build partnerships for queer organizations in your area. All right. Any questions about trans inclusion?
We have a few, so I will read them out to you.
Okay.
So, okay. So Margaret from Utica College asked, do ILSs allow for genders other than male, female, or an inclusion of pronouns?
I do not know.
The next question is from.
I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for that.
I thought your response was funny. I'm sorry.
I know many things, but I do not know all the things. And one of the powers of a librarian is knowing that you don't know something and then digging up information on it. But I think that in an ILS, if there's anything related to pronouns, it's probably going to be in some kind of notes field and not in its own explicit field, because a lot of ILSs are developed by, you know, old cis white men. Okay, sorry, next.
So Danielle from Syracuse University says, I've heard different perspectives on the relationships libraries should have with Harry Potter due to the author's transphobia. I'd love to hear your thoughts on using Harry Potter in programming / taking up library space, and if it can be inappropriate.
Ha ha! You didn't think we were going to get through this whole talk without mentioning the wizard in the room, right? Harry Potter is not the end-all, be-all pinnacle of wizardly experience in our literary canon. J.K. Rowling has taken a very strong, very public, very hostile stance against transgender people and in support of transphobic, exclusionary people. When an author is dead, or they're from an earlier era, or they come out and apologize, or they backtrack, or they reform their character, it can be easier to accept and make exceptions for them. When it's a present author continuing to cause harm, writing under the pseudonym Robert Galbraith and writing about, murderous, evil trans people, J.K. Rowling's impact doesn't stop with Harry Potter. And the ripples continue outwards. I certainly don't expect her to recant her position or say, gosh, I was wrong about trans people. I really should support them. She doesn't care. She is a wealthy, white, cisgender billionaire. She doesn't need our money. She doesn't need our support. And I think there are so many other things that libraries can do and create and host that still tap into magic and wonder and excitement and fantasy without it being Harry Potter. Continuing to access Harry Potter in spaces, in my opinion, is really harmful. I'm not saying throw her books away, but I am saying, do we really need to focus on her? Okay, and I'm a trans person and I'm non-binary, but I don't speak for the entire trans and non-binary community. Some folks have decided to divorce the art from the artist. Some folks say, there's no author, it just happens to exist. Some people say, well, I'm trans, but I still love Harry Potter and I'm gonna go to Wizarding World. Everybody's going to be different, but I don't think it hurts to move towards a more generic wizarding type of idea, to focus on other books that are more diverse, more intersectional, newer, and really give kids a chance to move past this book, this series of books that was very popular, but they've been around for an incredibly long time, and I think it's perfectly fine to start moving beyond it. If you have Harry Potter stuff planned that you can't get out of, which hopefully nobody's in that position right now, think about pivoting towards a more generic wizarding thing. Maybe they're not Hufflepuffs and Gryffindors, maybe they're, puddle jumpers and leapfroggers. Be creative. We are a creative field. All right. So I think we're starting to run low on time. But I did want to talk about some alternatives to Harry Potter that are out there. The Brooklyn Public Library has made a nice little list of more trans-inclusive magic books. Just doing a quick search online for, trans-inclusive wizard books will pull up plenty of results. Outside of libraries, there are so many issues that have come up for trans folks, especially within the last 4 years of our current political regime. Rollbacks of legal protections, trans health protections being taken away, then being reinstated, employment discrimination being okayed, then taken back, housing discrimination. All of these things are not just limited to trans patrons and to our trans coworkers, but they impact trans folks. And when a group of people is impacted, that's going to influence how that comes into the library, right? So, difficulty securing employment and employment discrimination can lead to housing insecurity and homelessness. And if you are dealing with housing insecurity and money issues, you may be impacted in your health. And then if you're losing access to trans-affirming healthcare, that impacts mental health. Trans and queer youth are at a very high risk of suicide. They are at risk of hate crimes. Domestic violence can be challenging, especially if you have a partner who is the same gender or you are in a non-traditional quote unquote relationship. And there may be a lack of social support systems and community resources in that immediate community. So these are all things that you do want to keep in mind when you are, thinking about your trans community members, your non-binary community members. We can't fix homelessness as libraries, but we can be mindful that some of the folks that we encounter may be facing some of these challenges because of their identity, their intersectional existence. With the rise in social workers in libraries, this is certainly a good thing to focus on. If you don't have access to social workers in your community, thinking about partnering with an LGBTQ organization so that your trans community members who may be struggling, your queer community members who may be struggling, have access to some resources, even if it's not, right in the neighborhood. A couple of really helpful resources for cisgender folks. There is the New York Transgender Advocacy Group, where you can learn about the different pieces of law and legislation and social issues that impact the trans community. There's another group called Sounds Like You Need to Be Educated on Transgender Individuals, but okay. Is on Facebook. They also have a website. They have helpful definitions. They have ways for folks to ask questions and have them be answered by trans and gender nonconforming people. There's also some great reading lists out there. Johns Hopkins Center for Transgender Health has a really extensive reading list. I put together a short book list of about 7 titles that are just basics on, trans, excuse me, trans identity, gender, and all of that fun stuff. So, I don't know, this is a complicated topic. And again, I don't really necessarily have answers or solutions for everything, but I really strongly encourage folks who are cis and, heterosexual to start thinking about how these things may impact their coworkers who are not cis. Thinking about how libraries can better embrace the full scope of the community, rather than just assuming that the default is straight and cisgender and white, and really building spaces where passively or actively trans folks feel like they can engage. Thank you.
No, thank you for this amazing presentation. Everyone has had such positive comments in here. There also were some book recommendations that I'll read out loud. So Joanne said, oh wait, no, someone else said magic. Someone said, there's many messages. Someone said Magic for Liars was a good book. Also Joanne said Upright Woman Wanted is great too. Timothy from Sable Library also mentioned The Magician's graphic novels by Lila Sturgis is also excellent and trans inclusive. Joanne also said Magic Misfits by Neil Patrick Harris. And a lot of people were just saying, thank you for this presentation. You're awesome. Resources you provided were amazing. Does anyone want to either raise your hand or if you have any other additional questions before we close out this amazing program?
I do also just want to say, like, you know, this is a pretty complicated topic and people might not feel comfortable asking a question or making a comment or sharing something because it's kind of a public forum. But if folks feel like contacting me, like absolutely feel free. I'm on Twitter as Djaz Hands, and I'm also on LinkedIn. I have my work email up here, and I'm happy to connect with folks. I'm happy to be your, you know, your trans library dad. You know, whatever folks need, I'm really happy to provide. It's not easy being in this world, especially in this political climate, for people who don't conform to gender binaries. So I absolutely want to be that resource for folks if they are looking for it.
Thank you so much. All right, well, that's it for this program. Thank you all for attending. Just so you know, this was recorded and it will be available at a later date right in the Feedloop platform. And feel free to contact Djaz with any questions that you have. Their contact information is right there. So there you go. Yeah, well, all right. Thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a great rest of the night. Happy Knowledge 2020.
Thank you for coming, everybody.